thank you to all the conference organizers for putting together such a rich series of panels and roundtables, and also for its meticulous organization, which deeply impressed us. I should also mention that although I'm going to present this myself, just for ease of not having handovers, Paola and I co-wrote this. So it's not my own work, and it's not my own fault if if we say something silly. So on that note, let us dive right into the presentation. As many of us know far too well, through the temporary closure of museums during the pandemic, virtual exhibits provide a way to connect with audiences who may not otherwise be able to visit a museum and experience its objects in person. When I speak of virtual exhibits, I refer partly to online exhibits that faithfully mimic the features of a museum's physical galleries. For example, in the form of virtual guided tours that the British Museum offers. I also use the term virtual exhibit more broadly to describe any online exhibit of objects, including those that display objects in isolation, say through 3D scans of artworks or artifacts placed against a black background. Over the last 10 or 15 years, virtual exhibits have become increasingly sophisticated in their renderings of objects, thanks in no small measure to new or more widely available technologies such as Street View and Sketchfab. Virtual exhibits also have exploded, both in sheer number and in the range of objects displayed. That said, one aspect of virtual exhibits that remains less than fully explored, both by scholars and by museum professionals, is the role that sound may play in spectators' experiences. For example, how do different types of soundscapes shape the amount of time spent viewing or otherwise engaging with objects in a virtual exhibit? And how do they shape one's emotional response to the exhibited objects, or the willingness to learn more about the objects on display? Based on research about spectators' experiences in bricks and mortar exhibition spaces, sound often has a decisive effect on a spectator's experience. This may occur, for example, by using sound to create more individually tailored experiences, or by provoking personal memories associated with the artworks or artifacts on display, as various scholars have shown. However, significant differences exist in how spectators perceive objects in virtual and physical exhibits. This is evident, say, in how one may virtually turn objects around or zoom in and out when viewing objects online, or in how one does not need to physically move one's entire body to view a sequence of objects in a virtual exhibit. Given such differences, our research team conducted an experiment with roughly 100 participants that explored how 4 different soundscapes shaped a spectator's response to objects virtually exhibited. To clarify our use of the term soundscapes, we refer here broadly to, quote, acoustic environments whose character is the result of action and interaction of natural and/or human factors, end quote. Our initial hypothesis guiding these experiments was that pairing soundscapes with objects in a virtual exhibit would enhance audience engagement. At the same time, based on the assumption that the soundscapes would likely have different effects on spectator engagement, we wanted to use the experiments to better understand such differences. In what follows, I'll present an overview of the experiment, followed by some key findings and a discussion of some of the project's broader implications. The crux of our findings, should anyone wish to cut to the punchline, is that certain soundscapes did have stronger effects on participants, but crucially in more complex ways than we anticipated, which stem from how audiences sought to make connections between the objects they saw and the soundscapes they heard. To briefly describe the experiment, which involved the project's 5 colleagues listed here on the screen, we originally had planned to bring participants into a lab to view objects paired with soundscapes, and that is to view them online, or rather on a screen paired with soundscapes, with the rationale being that we wanted to record physiological data that would provide indicators of each participant's engagement levels and affective responses. However, because COVID hit just as we were launching our live experiments, we pivoted to create an online experiment based entirely on surveys. As part of this online experiment, we presented participants with 3D models of objects, which we downloaded from the British Museum's online collection of 3D models, which is publicly available free of charge through Sketchfab. The models, which were displayed separately and could be rotated and substantially enlarged if the participant wished, were paired with a single soundscape. That is, each object had its particular soundscape. These pairings were pseudo-randomized across participants, with at least one pairing that included a no sound condition to act as a control. Following each pairing, participants answered a series of questions to describe their general valence level and their impression about the objects and soundscapes. For example, how interesting they found the object's features, or whether they felt the audio or silence added to their experience of the object. Based on the answers we received to questions such as those reproduced here on the right, we calculated what we called participants' engagement levels, which, to be clear, were based on their own self-reporting through rankings and multiple choice questions. Alongside these questions, we also asked one open-ended question, which you can see here on the bottom left, that we then used for qualitative analysis. To clarify the soundscapes used in the experiment, we had 4 different types. The first involved the ambient, and I'll just run through these briefly and give you snippets of each. The first involved the ambient noises one typically hears in museums, say the rumbling of footsteps or echoes, and I'll play that here just a few seconds. The second category of soundscapes was based on soundtracks loosely inspired by each object on display. For example, an ancient gourd was accompanied by sounds that included the occasional flowing of water. Here, our approach was modeled on the use of sound in many video games and films, where it serves to enhance imagery, but without necessarily incorporating naturalistic elements of the objects, environments, or events seen in such images. And here's one example. The third category was a synthesized set of soundscapes, roughly in the tradition of sound artists such as Brian Eno. And here we go. Let's all go clubbing. The fourth category was a sonic collage combining sound effects from the International Affective Database of Sounds, or IADS, which is a repository of sound samples pre-rated for their emotional responses that they evoke in listeners. And here we go. You get the idea, and I can't figure out how to get those stopped. In any case, so we did those 4 different kinds of soundscapes. And in addition to that, we produced a voiceover recording of a short narrative of about 150 words for each object. And this had 3 levels of pedagogical information: a general overview of the object, details about the maker, and last but not least, details about the socioeconomic or socio-political context in which the object was created. And the idea here was that we wanted to figure out whether participants would want to learn more about these objects. And so in one of our experiments trial groups, we gave these participants the choice to listen to some or all of this additional interpretive information. Upon concluding these trials, our computer science colleagues used a multi-level linear regression model and other tools to quantitatively analyze the responses provided by participants. And here's a summary here. And the main objective was to measure the relative effect of each soundscape type on a spectator's engagement level. My colleague Paola, who is an archaeologist by training, also did a detailed qualitative analysis of responses to the open-ended question. One major finding from our experiment was that considerable differences existed in the degree of spectatorial engagement associated with each soundscape. For example, participant engagement levels were higher with object-inspired soundscapes and synthesized soundscapes than with the other types, including silence. We also found that participants were not especially interested, if participants were not especially interested in an object, varying a soundscape could increase their reported engagement. However, if they varying a soundscape did not significantly alter engagement, should a participant already consider an object interesting. Through our qualitative analysis of open-ended answers, we reinforced our conclusion based on the quantitative data that object-inspired and synthesized soundscapes were the most engaging categories. What surprised us, however, is that spectators did not necessarily view such engagement in a positive light. For instance, nearly half of our participants who heard the synthesized soundscape described it as, and I'll just quote verbatim here, unsettling, creepy, disturbing, inappropriate, or the like. Similarly, over half the participants who listened to the IADS soundscape described it as, quote unquote, annoying or disruptive. Indeed, one participant reported that the synthesized soundscape made him feel that the object was a quote unquote fake, while another said that the sound represented the sacred aura of the object shown, in this case, a 6th century bell belonging to an abbot. Through such objects, hold on, let me just, okay, and this was, okay, through such objects, we inferred that soundscapes may affect a participant's perception of the work's authenticity and use, although further study is required to clarify this point. Perhaps the most striking comment of all from the open-ended questions was one participant's suggestion that the quote-unquote unsettling feeling that came from the soundscape caused them to focus on the head of the object you see here, the queen from the Lewis Chessman, and to focus on the head much more than any other detail. And the reason was, in this participant's opinion, the head was, quote, the most unsettling part of the object, end quote. This comment, along with others provided, suggests that soundscapes may prompt audiences to consider the possible connections between what they hear and what they see, including, and even especially so, when they deem the soundscapes unsettling, disturbing, or disruptive. In my final remarks, I'd like to think about some of the broader implications of our finding. In short, what do we really learn from the data? And what future areas of study do they suggest might be fruitful? To begin, I must stress that the experiment constituted a modest first step in better understanding how sound may shape a spectator's experience of virtual exhibits. For example, although we evaluated how audiences responded to objects displayed virtually, and although we had enough participants to derive statistically significant conclusions, each object was displayed in a very simple manner, namely isolated against a dark or otherwise empty background, and thus not part of an ensemble of objects, nor presented in a context of a more sophisticated virtual guided tour. As such, any follow-on studies that our research team conducts must obviously account for how sound affects a spectator's experiences in different modes of display. Additionally, even if the pandemic required us to shift from a lab-based experiment to one conducted entirely online, our research team very much wanted to record physiological data to better understand how sound shapes participants' engagements with objects and virtual exhibits. After all, although the online experiment did allow participants to self-report their mood, interest level, and other facets of their experience, such self-reported responses did not necessarily match what one finds when recording physiological data. For instance, because spectators may not be fully aware of their own body's experiences to what they are sensing and hearing. That all said, the data from the first experiment does point to some potentially interesting ways that sound uh, may be used to, may be more fully harnessed when virtually exhibiting objects. For example, one basic takeaway from our study is that sound may generate higher engagement levels among visitors to virtual exhibits. At the same time, it was striking that synthesized soundscapes were considered among the two types that generated the highest engagements. This finding, which broadly chimes with the so-called Foley effect of using non-realistic sounds in film and video games, suggests that creative sound design may offer the most promising avenues for integrating sound into virtual exhibits. From a budgetary perspective, this is not exactly news that museums want to hear, since bespoke sound design is time-consuming and ultimately quite costly. At the same time, one potential solution might involve the automated design of soundscapes, be it through AI or other tools, a rich area of current study and development at the present, and one that would be particularly interesting as an approach for designing soundscapes in the object-inspired category. And Sabine, I see you we're drawn to a close shortly here. As someone who's studied National Socialist exhibition design in the 1930s and 40s, I must admit that I am personally skeptical of any attempt by museums or scholars to blindly embrace sound as a way to heighten spectatorial engagement with virtually exhibited objects. Indeed, if we've learned anything from history, both in general and within the context of exhibition design, it's that critical thinking matters. As such, one of the responsibilities I see as falling on the shoulders of museum professionals and those who study exhibitions is how we can make audiences think more critically, both about the objects they encounter in exhibits, but also about the larger world in which these objects are embedded. Based on the findings from our first experiment, I was cautiously optimistic that participants often did think about the relationship between the sounds they heard and the objects they saw. For example, when trying to decode the links between the two. However, in future iterations of this study or any other about sound's relationship to virtual exhibits, it would be productive to get at how sound might play a role in stimulating critical thought, be it about a given object's meaning or use value, the social and political context in which it was produced, or about how that object found its way into a given collection. While this all might seem a bit pie in the sky to some, it's in fact quite feasible based on the kind of questions one asks participants, the kind of interpretive information one provides, and the analysis of open-ended answers. It's also possible to develop future studies that focus on how user-driven soundscapes within virtual exhibits might contribute to upending the intended forms of influence over spectators' behavior. And finally, if we move beyond the thorny question of critical thinking to consider some more practical considerations of using sound in virtual exhibits, it seems important to remember that virtual exhibits do not exist in isolation. After all, although the physical exhibition spaces of museums and galleries may at times be closed, and although not all spectators may visit these spaces in person, many visitors engage with online resources before and after their actual visits. As such, one key question we must address is how sound may be used to heighten spectator engagement in both virtual and physical exhibits. To this end, it's necessary for future studies to develop a more granular understanding of the similarities and differences in how sound shapes behavior in virtual versus physical exhibits, and how we may use this understanding to develop complementary approaches to soundscape design. Moreover, as we work toward developing such complementary approaches, one issue that we will inevitably face is how we use sound is the degree of customization at the individual user level. To this end, a responsive sound system that dynamically adapts to individual participants' reactions may be beneficial. For instance, by harnessing the power of behavioral or physiological measures as a control signal, as some scholars have done in the fields of affective computing and brain-computer interfacing. In a related vein, but not defined solely by questions of customizations, it seems worth acknowledging that many participants likely prefer some alternation in the kind of soundscapes they hear, including periods of silence. As such, future studies will need to probe how variations in soundscapes shape spectators' responses to the objects exhibited in both physical and virtual settings, how such alternations may be customized, and how they may be used to foster more critical forms of engagement with the objects exhibited, so we don't fall prey to an attempt to use an unrelenting stream of sound that risks anesthetizing spectators, to draw upon and reshape an idea from Theodor Adorno's discussion of Richard Wagner's music. Needless to say, these and other questions will confront us as we embark on developing a more nuanced understanding of the ways that sound may be used in exhibits, both virtual and physical. Nevertheless, one thing does remain certain. If we wish to use sound in exhibits, it's crucial to question well-worn assumptions about spectator behavior, to better measure and analyze how spectators respond, and to ultimately organize our research and applied uses of sound in ways that advance critical thought. Thank you.